I'm going to talk to you about an absolutely amazing stage of development, which is called adolescence. Now, you might have thought that you were coming to a talk on the adolescent problem brain. Well, I'm not going to talk about the adolescent problem brain. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges as their brain is changing that make it a bit challenging for us. But just so you get it right up front, I want to convince you that we need more people saying this is a magical time in life, that we need to be maximizing how kids do well. Not just focusing on the things that are a bit more challenging. All right, just so you know, but we're going to have lots of time for questions as well. So I always start with a dedication to my teachers who have gone before me. And it's really important for me to do that. I come from a family of educators, and education is in my bones, it's in my blood. And the two men that you see here who are no longer with us have played a great influence on my career. Dr. Dan Offord, a child psychiatrist who was the very first person in Canada to ask the question, how big an issue are mental health problems in our kids? And when I was a resident with Dan, we didn't know if childhood and adolescent mental illness like depression, is that different than adult mental health? We didn't really know because, you know, adults, we used criteria that said, you know, you have to be down for 2 weeks, you have to feel guilty, not much energy. And as we were working with kids, what we found was that's not exactly how it looks like when we think kids are depressed. Very often, they're really irritable and cranky rather than have a low mood. So he developed the survey, the Ontario Child Health Study, and if anybody calls you to be involved in the Ontario Child Health Study, say yes, you want to be involved in it. It's being repeated now. But he developed with his colleagues at the Offord Centre a survey to find out how big an issue is mental health. Because if you don't have the data, then people say, well, there's no problem, so then you don't have any action. So he was the one who first identified 1 in 5 kids have a significant mental health problem. 1 in 5 kids. And so with that, children's well-being and mental health got more of a focus. Now, having more of a focus has not necessarily led to better mental health for kids yet. We're still working on that very intensively. But one of the reasons that Dan was so interested in this was he noticed that where you're born, what your postal code is, even in Ontario, what your postal code can be a pretty good predictor of how early you're going to die, of how well you're going to do in school. What he saw was that there's a gradient, you know, a kind of a slope. When you are well-to-do, you do better in school, you have better health. If you're poor, you are more likely to not do so well in school, to have worse health. And he said, how is this possible? We have public education for all, we have a healthcare system for all, and yet life is not fair for many, many kids. And you can think of kids who that's true for. And so he dedicated his life and inspired many of us who were his students to battle this, to say, why is it? And does it have to be that if you are poor, that you're going to run into trouble? And so his influence has affected education. I'm one of 4 advisors to the Premier because of the education I got from Dan. And a passion to say, well, how can all kids reach the potential that they have? But you know, the other thing about Dan was that when you were with him, he was a busy guy, a big guy. He always asked me, how's your garden? And he knew I frickin' hated gardening, but he would ask. I'm not really sure. It was just something he could connect with. We bought this house and they had this huge garden that the people who had lived there before lived their whole life for it. And my first gardening experience, I pulled out all the delphiniums, which are these lovely plants. I thought they were weeds. Anyway, but he was very keenly interested in people. And when you were with him, you had a sense of felt connection. You felt by Dan. And that is one of the goals that I have as I talk to people more and more across the country, is how can we create communities? How can we create schools? How can we create homes, houses, where more kids feel felt, emotionally connected to the significant adults in their lives? I have a dream that every single child will have at least one adult whose eyes light up when they walk in the room. If we had that, I would be put out of business, and I would be very, very happy if that were the case. Imagine a world where every child feels loved and lovable. We can get there, but we have to have the knowledge and understanding of where do some of the challenges come from. My other friend there, Dr. Clyde Hertzman, is a fellow who was very, very curious. And he's the first person who was able to identify how experiences around you change your brain and actually get underneath your skin. He called it biological embedding. How is it that how much you get read to and hugged and sung to as a baby builds your brain in a different way than if you are ignored or maltreated? How is it that those different experiences change how you grow? And what he learned and has told many, many people is that the experience turns on or silences your DNA. I'm going to tell you more about that because I want you to think about your experience, what you hear, how you're treated, what you learn, changes your brain chemistry, and that changes because your DNA is changing. It's changing in different activities. So if we think about our adolescents and we realize, okay, if their brains, as I'm going to show you, is built by the environment, wow, if they're in an environment that says, you know, teenagers these days, all they are trouble, they turn into aliens, they're into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you know, if that's how they're viewed and treated, that's going to change their brain. But if people understand that their brain is changing lots and lots, that they are actually under construction, that they're not many adults, that some of the risky things they do is because their brain is changing, and what they need is for us as adults to be more supportive, setting limits, but being their emotional coach in this difficult time. So that's giving you a preview of what the next hour is going to be. Anybody want to go back to Kobo? To the other hall? No, okay, all right, good. So I'm a medical doctor. I have to tell you if I've got a big drug company sponsoring me, right? If I have any conflict of interest. So I always throw in this picture of my 5 great kids because these are my sponsors. Now I always have to say, any of you from Newfoundland and Labrador? Anybody have that kind of weird sense of humor? I was in Newfoundland and Labrador and a colleague was thanking me and she said, you know, Jean showed us that picture of her 5 great kids. Now I wonder, does she have a few others who aren't so great that she doesn't show the picture of? Well, just so you know, I don't have any other children. These are my 5 great kids, same dad as of the last text I got from him. So same genes, right? But they are so completely different, completely Utterly different. They have the same genetic donations. My oldest son, Andrew, over here, firstborn, really easy. He was easy to figure out. If he cried, I knew what to do. So we were like, oh man, we're great parents, such great genes. Then 18 months later, along came our second, Kathlina. Now, warning, she came out looking like Winston Churchill, you know. And when she latched to the breast immediately and powerfully, whoa! And she was intense, and she remained intense for many, many years. I hadn't heard anything about temperament. As a psychiatry resident, as a medical student, I knew nothing about temperament. So we had to read. We read Raising Your High Needs Baby, Your Difficult Child. I loved that book, except the guy was a pediatrician who he saw lots of mums and dads. And if they had these babies who were a bit harder to figure out, who cried a lot, he would say, "They're there, dear. You know, you're just anxious." And then didn't the Creator give him one? He coined the term for these babies who are more difficult to figure out, who are more intense. They cry louder. They don't like change. They hate the feel of things. He called them mother killers. Well, you know, that might work for some, but if you're a child psychiatrist, it's not exactly the kind of language you're supposed to use. So we read, and we came across a book called Raising Your Spirited Child. If any of you have a child or a grandchild or a student who is more intense, they feel things more, they notice things more, you must go from here and download Raising Your Spirited Child on your phone. It saved our lives. We had no idea that there was such a big difference in how kids come out and interact with the world. I couldn't go back to residency because Kathlina, if she wasn't with me, she was crying. She wouldn't take a bottle. I had to nurse her. So we had to figure out, how can we help her soothe her strong, intense emotion? How can we help her soothe her intense feelings? She didn't like change. As a toddler, she started to walk and then she ran. As she was learning how to talk, she had words daily. When she started a little Montessori program, she liked it for the first hour, but then the teacher said, "I've never heard a child cry so loudly." Oh my God, what were we going to do with her? When she was 3, she loved her big brother, and they wore a little uniform, so she wore the boys' uniform. Now you may think, what's the big deal? Well, I'm a child psychiatrist with a cross-dressing 3-year-old. This is kind of hard, man. So what we had to do is we read and read, but we had to really look in our hearts of hearts. I got all kinds of advice. Oh, Hen, let her cry it out. It's good for her lungs, right? Let her cry it out. Couldn't do it. We intuitively knew that our job as her mum and dad was to have a way of helping her learn to interact with the world. That her social and emotional development was going to be a bit harder, but that we had to find the goodness of fit. The goodness of fit between her temperament and ours. You'll pick up very quickly that I'm a little spirited myself. So thank goodness for her dad. Her dad was able to do the tag team bit. So what we bring to our parenting has a big influence on how we relate to our kids. We had to figure out different ways, and we thought we were good parents. And then another one would come along, and oh my God, I don't know what to do about this. So my mantra is progress, not perfection. Progress, not perfection. If anybody in the room has a good suggestion about how to get your 21-year-old who's at university to give you at least a week's notice before the rent is due, I'd really like it. Right? How many times have I said, Jojo, you have to let me know a little in advance when your rent is due? Oh, sorry, Mum, I will next time. So, progress, not perfection. I ain't perfect. You have a question, do not worry about asking the child psychiatrist, because I have some pretty colorful stories from my own kids. So, we need to be examining who we are and what it is that we bring to our parenting. Especially, we've made it through. Has everybody made it through the toddler years in the room? And you thought you were doing real good, and now here you are. Along comes, you were just figuring it out. Life was nice and stable, and suddenly the kids' brains or their behavior's changing again. But not only that, their behavior is changing again, but you didn't really get mad too much at your toddlers. But along come your adolescents, and they do things that enrage you. You get so angry, and you wonder, where can that anger, am I not a nice, loving mummy? How can I be so angry? Anybody identifying with this, or is this all by my, yes, thank you very much. So, I want to just start with us as we explore this teenage adolescent brain. I want to start from a bit of a philosophical stance, and that is to ask us, what is your view of your child? What is your view? Do you see your role as a parent that you have to fix them, have them behave in a certain way, be successful by doing all of these things? Or do you believe that as a parent, your role is to create the environment where they can thrive, where they can make mistakes and you're there to help pick them up? Is your view of your kids like our First Nations teachings? Our First Nations teachings I learned first from an elder, Tom Porter, that children are the sacred ones. They are the heart of the community. Whenever we're making decisions, we need to think not just about today, but about the next 7 generations. Do we view our teens in this way? That they are the sacred ones, that our interaction with them is not just about today, but for much longer. Because, you know, our kids, the teenage years are tumultuous. There's no question about that. But the majority of kids get through the teen years. Is your relationship with them going to survive the teen years? What's your view of your young person? Do you think in a negative way about them or in a positive way? Because what we think affects how we feel, affects how we act. If we think that the teen years are full of this rebellious behavior and full of conflict, then we're ready. You know, we're going to be Texas, lock them and load them, right? We're going to make them behave. We're going to crack down on them. If that's our view, then our interactions with kids are going to be very different. But if our interactions are based on a view that says adolescents are not mini adults, they look like adults, they can think really well, but they are not yet fully, their brain is not fully wired up. We used to think it was hormones, right? Oh my Lord, in come the hormones and out goes the sense. Well, what we now know is that it's not about hormones. It's about the brain changing. Now, I did not know this. We did not know this when I was in medical school. Oh, well, I guess it's not such a big deal because it was a long time ago, 1981. Oh, my God, that was a lot. That was before some of the teachers I was talking today to were born. Oh, my God. Anyway, in 1981, we didn't know this about the brain that I'm going to tell you now. We in the past, now I say we, I have to tell you this. My kids say, Mom, make sure you say this all the time. When I say we, what I mean is the research that I've stolen from other people, right? I do not do this research myself. My research is on little kids. I don't do this research myself. I steal it. And because I've stolen it, you get to steal it too. So what we now know in the past 10 years is that there's much more change happening in the brain than we ever knew. The areas of the brain that are changing involve thrill-seeking, pleasure-seeking, sensation, novelty. There is a drive from the brain in adolescence to seek more of that stuff. That part of the brain is developing. So kids do some pretty dumb things. It's developing before the executive director is fully developed. The front part of the brain is plan, organize, decision-making, impulse inhibition. Does this sound like a list for any of us? That is much later to develop. So we've got oh man, I want to do this fun stuff, before the director says, one moment, please. One moment, please. The activity you are about to engage in is very dangerous. Those wirings are not there yet. How do we know this? We now know it because we can look inside the brain in ways that we couldn't before. Before you had to do biopsies, cut things or give drugs or give stuff so that you could get pictures. Now we can do what are called magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, or even functional MRIs, fMRIs, where you don't just see the structure of the brain, but you actually see how the brain is active. And what has been discovered in the past decade or so is that we used to think that the brain, when a baby is born, we know that the head is only about a quarter of its adult size, but then by the time they're about 5 or 6, it's pretty well, it's almost adult size, about 90%. So we thought that not much more changed dramatically within the brain because, here you've got this fixed structure and it's at that size. But boy, oh boy, was that wrong. What was discovered by looking at kids every year or every couple of years over and over again was that there is massive pruning and sculpting and remodeling of the brain that happens in the teen years, in the adolescent brain. We didn't know this before. So what does it mean? Well, it means that we have an unbelievable opportunity. It's a time when the brain, whatever a young person is doing, that's what's building their brain. They're not limited by our adult knowledge of what's possible. So their creativity is magnificent. If you want a problem solved, ask a bunch of teens. Many of the discoveries that have been made have been done by people who have the free-ranging connectivity that teenagers have. So it's all about the brain that is under construction. But let's just talk a little bit about the basics of the brain very, very briefly. We used to think that you were born with your intelligence pretty well figured out. You were going to be as smart as your parents. They've got their genes and they come together and, your IQ is determined by how smart they are and, the next kid has less and by the time you get to 5, they don't have very much more left. Only kidding. But, we used to think that that's your IQ and it's pretty well fixed. We used to think you get a gene for height and so that will determine how tall you're going to be. And then, so we had these big arguments. Is it nature or is it nurture? Is it the environment or is it genes? Do you guys remember these arguments? We used to have them all the time when I was doing my first degree. Well, what we now know is that it is genes interacting with the environment that determine who we become. One of the things we now know is that IQ is not fixed. I personally know a young girl whose both of her parents have mental retardation, right? So they have IQs that are quite low. With our old model, we would have said, okay, so mom's IQ is 60, dad's IQ is 60. That's the genes. There's no way the kid's going to be 100. In fact, that young girl I'm thinking about is now doing her master's degree. So what her genes were was very much adapted by the environment. There are studies that look at twins, identical twins, who are raised apart, right? So we get genes from our parents about how tall we're going to be. One of these twins, one example, one guy is 6'2". So he had a gene for being tall, right? So the gene that he got from his parents was one that was tall. His environment was one that gave him the proper nutrition and the proper exercise, so that gene, getting all of this stuff in, got turned on, and he became tall. His identical gene brother, identical genes. He was adopted out, and he had a family that had lots of trouble. He did not live in a place where he was well nurtured. He did not get lots of activity and stimulation and all that growth hormone. So he was only about 5'2". Well, wait a second. His dad's genes were 6 foot. Why is he 5'2"? Why is it? Because he had the genes to be tall, but those genes were not turned on by the environment. You seeing this? So here we have a whole new world, that genes can be altered, not the actual DNA sequence, but whether they're active or silenced by the experience that you have. Here's another one. I have a Scottish accent. You hear it, isn't it lovely? Yes, you love that Scottish accent? Now, I have this Scottish accent because my genes, my brain cells, let's talk about brain cells. So our brain cells are called neurons. When a baby is born, they've got 100 billion, but they're not nearly all connected up. So my language neurons, brain cells, what they heard over and over and over again was the sound of the Scottish language. So they went, and my hearing neurons and my seeing, you know, because how you use your mouth and everything, all of that got wired up. Over and over and over again, I heard the Scottish accent. So the neurons that I had wired up all together, and then the ones that I didn't use got snipped away. I cannot speak without this Scottish accent. It is wired into my brain. Now, my younger brothers, they have Canadian accents. My older sister and brothers, they have Scottish accents. So my neurons, my brain cells were all wired up in this way. My kids are bilingual. They speak Scottish and Canadian, eh? So think about this in terms of your parenting and what you bring to parenting. Because the way you think, what you find funny, what you hate, what you feel passionate about, all of that has been constructed by your experience, turning on your brain cells, silencing some brain cells, accenting others, making all kinds of different connections. So the world is very different. What we used to see before, what we used to think about the genes determine who you are, we now know, man oh man, the world is very different. The brain is now way more plastic than we ever thought possible. So I've talked about the early years, really important, and I've talked about adolescence as another time, and I'll talk more about that. But I also want to say that what we've learned is that the brain is capable of change throughout life. Right? So some of you may be sitting thinking, oh, she said that, you know, we get wired up in our parenting by what we have experienced. So does that mean that we're kind of screwed if we kind of got effed over, you know, frick? No. What we now know is that the brain is capable of change throughout life. I told a story today. There's a great book called The Brain That Changes Itself. And in The Brain That Changes Itself, there's one of the stories that says about a professor who had a massive stroke. He had this stroke and he couldn't walk and talk. He had a rehab in hospital, and then he was sent home. They had done everything they could for him. But his sons said, "This isn't Papa." And what they did, one happened to be a neuroscientist, and he said, "You know, the brain develops from primitive functions like crawling to more complicated functions like walking and running. So how about we work with Papa, who can't walk, by going all the way back to helping him crawl? And might we be able to rewire his brain?" Well, that Dr. Bachirita went back to teaching at university. The father, he died climbing a frickin' mountain a decade later. In 1981, when I graduated from medical school, if you had told me that, I would have said, "That's a great science fiction story." We didn't believe it was possible, so we didn't see it. We didn't believe that it was possible, so we didn't see. So when we're thinking, I'm bringing it back to how we interact with our adolescents, I want you to keep that in mind. As we are thinking about, well, you know, I'm really fighting against the way that I was raised, remember, the brain is capable of change throughout life. I have seen kids who had terrible starts who have done magnificently well. I, in fact, work with several people who know the child welfare system inside out. And it was one person who made a huge difference in their life. One person whose eyes light up, who said, "Man, you can write," who made all that difference. That rewired the brain. Not easily, but it did. So we're now in a new age of neuroscience. The brain, the plasticity is really, really great. So, you know, even if you live with a grumpy old fart, you can say, "I heard this psychiatrist last night, and she said you can change." But you have to want to. You have to want to. So the old science was that the brain had these fixed structures and set ways of unfolding, but the new science is all about plasticity. It's all about how the brain is built by the experience. And the other big part that we've learned is that the brain is built magnificently through relationships and through connection. I'm going to tell you more about the social brain and how we as a species are wired to connect. And that if you are cut off and isolated from others, it creates the same pathways in your brain as if you had been physically hurt. We are a social organ.